And here we are again, everybody. Another deep dialogue in June of 2024. We have a remarkable lady sitting before us. Another lady. Yes, this is a season of female global soul stewards, each with remarkable stories. I'm sure you've all been tuning into every single one of them, and you're absolutely enchanted, bemused, fascinated, extended. So namaste, namaste to the audience. And let me introduce dear Lisa to you all. I have her bio in front of me as usual, so we have precise transmissions. Remember, Deep Dialogues is a platform for a deep dialogue. So Lisa won't be shooting into a presentation. We'll be holding a really significant conversation between the two of us. And the whole idea of deep dialogues is that we go below surface, we go into the causative, we go into the archetypal, we go into the collective unconscious that is there meaningfully stirring the pot at this time as we see a way of progressing and literally developing a new hierarchy of values out of the old and to create a brave new world. So don't forget. Lisa Bonnice is the authoress and numerous books. Lisa is the authoress of numerous books, including Fear of Our Father, a best-selling true crime novel, which has been featured in television and radio programs, both in the US and in the UK, and which is soon to be made into a movie. Love to hear about that. Lisa is also the author of a series of metaphysical comedy novels, which includes Fairy on My Shoulder and Fairy Falls. She is a former associate producer for MSNBC.com, and Lisa has been a popular program host with the Shift Network for many years, which is where she and I met. She wonderfully managed my program through the Shift Network. And Lisa has been a popular host within this particular context, hosting all sorts of programs, not just for individual teachers, spiritual teachers or healers, but also with annual ancestral healing and Beyond the Veil summits. And that's particularly apropos for our time together today. Her recent historical fiction novel, Castle Gate, is book one in a series about the origin and after effects of a curse that was placed on her family lineage dating back to the 1600s. The discovery of this event launched Lisa into an obsession with genealogical research and epigenetics and into a profound journey about her own ancestral healing, because obviously it was her family line that was being affected. It was her spirit line and her bloodline converged. And so therefore she is a guardian for this particular form of information. And so we will be talking about curses. If that's something that you don't really want to listen to, then please switch off now. Otherwise, keep tuning in, because we're going to talk about it in a highly prudent, serious and multidimensional way. So this isn't just simply about committing ourselves to stories. It's actually going into the themes that pour forth from the stories that are actually the karmic lesions or the karmic ribbons that allow that state of consciousness to exist. And of course, Lisa and I know will go into a definition of, well, what is a curse? And are they real? And how do they affect our consciousness? And so on and so forth. So Lisa, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
I am so glad this is finally happening. We've been talking about this for, weeks and weeks, months even, and it's finally happening. So Stuart, thank you for having me. I'm so looking forward to this.
Oh, bless you, darling. And just so that we have location, you're in California?
I am in Phoenix, Arizona. Close enough, but a little further away.
You're in Arizona. I'm sorry. Okay. So Lisa, as you see, is in Phoenix, Arizona, and I'm in London, England. So shall we start at the top with Castle Gate, which has become, is that a good place to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Where would you like to start with Castlegate? There's so many entry points. What would you like to know first, I think?
Well, of course, I have your wonderful press release here, so I can give us context. So you don't necessarily need to go into storyline. We can get the
Okay.
general context for what was taking place. And then we can go into the significant principles and interrogate them and open them up and intercept
Okay.
all of the psychic details that are within. Is that a good idea?
Sounds perfect. Perfect.
So,
All right.
the novel that we've just been referring to, which is epic, it's book one of a series, as you've just heard, is the unfolding nature of this. Castlegate is the true and tragic saga of a Scottish family whose dreams of finding their fortunes in the bountiful coal mines of Castlegate, Utah, during the Prohibition era, exploded in one of the most devastating mine disasters in American history. In their, in their presence, there had been bad luck. Or was it due to some form of generational curse dating back to their ancestors' involvement in a grisly witchcraft trial at the beginning of the 1600s? This is based on genealogical research that Lisa, in a very competent and highly relative way, has entered into, developing Castlegate, which tells the story of her particular family and how the family line was destroyed by this documented curse, which has been wreaking havoc in countless lives all over the world for centuries. Context. And so, how did it first come to your consciousness to explore the nature of Castlegate?
Well, I knew about it sort of at the back of my mind that there was this mine explosion, but I was interested in other paths of my genie. I figured I'll get back to that story. But then when I started working with the Shift Network, I was listening to Sandra Ingerman, a really gifted shamanic journeying teacher, and she was talking about the symptoms of a curse. And I listened to her and thought, oh my God, I tick every single box. So I asked her, what do I do about this? So she recommended someone who studied with her. And this woman named Barb did a shamanic journey for me. And she, during this journey, discovered there was this curse in my lineage. And I thought, I don't really believe in curses, but okay, we'll go along with this. Just I get the metaphysics of it. Fine, we'll use your language. So then I came home and I looked at my ancestry tree, which, you know, it's there's stuff that you know for a solid fact, and there's other things that you've got sort of earmarked. We'll go back to that. And I noticed that one of those earmarked stories fit that exact timeline that she mentioned. And I found, oh my God, this ancestor was cursed. It's documented. This person was involved in a witchcraft trial, and one of the accused cursed his family. You know, you shall suffer as we suffer, and they were burned at the stake. And I mean, that's interesting enough as it was. But then when I fast forward to about 100 years ago, where my Scottish ancestors came over to Utah, as you mentioned earlier, 3 of them were killed in a fiery explosion. And then the next generation, my grandmother was killed as a result of a kitchen fire. Her son, my uncle, he's had numerous house fires. It's just fire is in the family, and I just couldn't ignore it. So I started looking into this and realized there's a story here. There's something that I really not just as a writer, but as somebody who's interested in, you know, the creation of reality and how we got where we are. I realized that this curse, let's just say curse, is still rippling forward, that it's still causing damage, all the it's dominoes falling just, you know, generations later. And if I know about it and I know how to do something about it, then it's sort of my job to do that. It's my responsibility. And that's I think the foundation of where this all began.
Beautiful. So, two questions. Firstly, what is a curse? And secondly, where did the genealogy of this particular curse within your family begin? Because apparently it hasn't had its ripple effect through you, but it has
Oh,
through your ancestors. Or
it
has it?
actually has. It has in different ways, but we'll come back to that. Let's talk about what curses are first.
So,
I'm
yeah.
glad you asked that. Um, because a lot of people, when they hear curses, they're like, oh, please, if you don't believe in a curse, it can't harm you. Well, that may be true in certain circumstances where if you're like, curses can't hurt me, then you are building up sort of a metaphysical, spiritual protective wall that could possibly keep you from the ill effects of somebody sending negative vibes at you. But in this case, if there was a curse blasted by somebody who's being executed, an innocent person being executed, and say, I curse you all, I cursed your family to suffer. Well, whether there's anything actually magical involved in that, how can those words not have an effect on the people that it's landing on? These people must have felt, horrible, because they're witnessing the murder of five, turns out, innocent people, but at the time they thought they really were witches. Still, they're witnessing something horrific that has got to affect you. It affects you psychologically, spiritually. And that's where the ripple effect begins, because then their offspring are going to be raised by parents who have this thing in their head, and that's that epigenetic thing that's getting passed on through the generations. And eventually people forget that this even happened, but the parents are still passing on, their trauma, their way of beingness. So if we just look at it from a psychological perspective, that's how it happens. If we look at it from a physical perspective, the epigenetics of it, trauma changes the way that your DNA, it doesn't change the DNA itself, it changes the way that it responds or that it activates. So the next generation will be born with their DNA either turned on or off in certain ways, and then the next generation and the next generation. So if we look at curses from that perspective, it doesn't sound like, ooga booga, airy fairy, woo woo stuff. It's actually, I think, something that happens a lot more often than we realize.
Yeah, and that bougie, bougie, bougie stuff is a reality as well. We know in some of the
Yeah.
great wizardry and some of the great witchcraft traditions that there
Mhm.
are techniques, there are rituals, there are initiations, there are
Mhm.
spells that can be utilized by those people who practice
Mhm.
within supernatural domains, who are in flesh but actually work through the varying domains of the overworld and the underworld.
Mhm.
That it is a reality, and it has been present in my life really since the beginning of my life, because I've been able to perceive the nature of the multidimensional reality, and when everything is imbalanced and when everything is in disharmony, and often in the disharmonic states have drawn people to me intuitively who have needed exorcism or have needed the release of curse. So there is the supernatural, but what we're really talking about is the preternatural formation of the way that in a very highly charged social situation that is deeply traumatic, the individual who's involved with the trauma has such a level of charge moving through their body, the superadrenalization of the fear or the horror or the trauma, whatever we describe it, actually has a charge that then penetrates the group or the individuals that are standing before, if they feel responsible, and I mean the ability to respond to the nature of curse. And therefore it becomes, as you've just placed, an unconscious lodging within our consciousness, within our emotional body, that then becomes repetitive through behaviors. And so it's handed down through generations and becomes part, as it were, of the genetic code,
Mhm.
which at this time, because we're looking into the fact that we are deliberately being given this remarkable information about the fact that we are the master mistresses of our own destiny, that we can't unravel this, but we do need help from a highly skilled practitioner. whether they be a shaman, whether they be a witch, whether they be a holistic healer, whether they be a competent psychic, but it's a world or an arena of extraordinary energy and activity. So your awakening, obviously, in relation to this particular curse, was not necessarily a trauma in your own life. It was actually something that you discovered and recognized the symptoms, as it were, appearing through the ancestral line. And then you chose to do something about it. Where did you begin?
Wow. Well, first I began by really digging into the story. I got obsessive about genealogy and I wanted to find out as much as I could about what really happened. And the more I looked into what happened with my ancestors in Castle Gate, which is incredibly documented, it was a treasure trove of information. And I got to know these people and I wanted to know more. So I ended up actually traveling to Scotland. It's something that I've always wanted to go abroad, but was never able to. Well, suddenly I'm able to. It just, I felt like the ancestors wanted me to dig this up. They were helping me from the other side. So they allowed this path to be opened up. So I visited Scotland. I walked in their footsteps. I witnessed where they lived, and I went to Castle Gate. I saw where the explosion happened. I went to even further back to where the witch trial occurred. I went to where the executions took place. There's a little park outside of Glasgow it's not very it's got kind of scary vibe, but it's where the executions used to take place. And I went in there and I did, a bit of a ritual, sort of an apology for my family's part in the role that they played. These little things, what I personally can do. As I said earlier, there's people all over the world who don't even know that they're related to this family. And I hope that the work that I'm doing will have those ripple effects for them. And then maybe their lives will start to become just a little bit looser and they'll be a little bit more healed. And that's what I'm hoping for, is this ripple effect, because this is a massive event. I mean, if this happened in the 1600s, think about how many people have been born and they don't even know they have this last name in their lineage. They're all over the world. And that's just one story. There are so many episodes of man's inhumanity to man that have happened over the course of history that we're all descended from. So we're all sort of living in this ripple effect of the horrors that have come before us. And look at the world we're in right now. And I kind of believe, no, I don't kind of, I absolutely believe that ancestral healing, those of us who are called to do this type of work, we are unraveling some of that in the hopes that this bonkers world that we're in right now maybe settles down just a bit and we release some of the karma, I guess, for lack of a better word, that we're facing right now. I think it's the most important time to do this kind of work.
Well, yes, I mean, we know primarily that the world is in the mess that it's in because we're at the end of an age and the beginning of a new age. I mean, this is a time of renaissance. We can't call it that because we're living it. But in 250, 300 years' time, our, our ancestors will look back at Renaissance. Just as we see with the end times of Atlantis, the fall of Rome, the ending of the Punic Wars in Greece, the French Revolution. This is all a time, the Elizabethan Renaissance, that moved from a total belief in the metaphoric consciousness into the mechanistic at the beginning of the 1600s, etc., etc. But at the same time, this is an overture that you're offering to us to look into any of the polluted lines of our own emotional experience, and within the family, or indeed with extrapolated relationships, with extended relationships, maybe it's appearing in our professional life as well, that we're seeing that we are the master mistress of our own destiny, and therefore we need to take full responsibility for the behaviors that are being perpetrated, and if they are gross, of how can we transform them, how can we alchemicalize them, because nothing is singular, everything is plural, so how can we turn the negative into the positive?
Yes. When we're focusing on ancestral trauma, we seem to focus on the negatives. But when we do ancestral healing work, we also can discover gifts and abilities that our ancestors possessed and may have been tamped down because of trauma and curses, etc. So by healing the negative, we do release the positive as well. So yes, good
Yeah.
point there.
Yes. Well, that's really what healing is all about, isn't it? Healing is a movement back to wholeness. But actually, the prima facie reason for why we're talking is about the trauma that creates the ill, that creates the disharmony, that creates the disquietude. And it seems that over the centuries, particularly since the beginning of the mechanistic, which we're talking about in terms of the beginning of the 1600s with the development of the Age of Enlightenment and the development of the mechanistic with the Cartesian invention of I think, therefore I am, rather than I think and I feel, and therefore I am what I am, that we literally unplugged from nature. I mean, there was a huge revolution that took place because up to that point, particularly in post-medievalism, there was a great belief that the planet was informed or was invested with the animating principle of the universe, which they believed was God's breath. And it was known as the anima mundi. I mean, this was taught in medieval university. But then along came Isaac Newton and said, this doesn't exist. The earth is merely a lump of matter hurtling through space. And so literally, as it were, overnight, we unplugged from an essential belief, which was, well, if I wish to heal myself, I need to go into the bounty of nature. And therefore, through praise, petition, and participation, I will be healed. And people genuinely felt this because they believed, and God breathed on the surface of the waters and brought forth life. And God breathed into the nostrils of man, and man became a living soul. But along came a major thought, and everybody unplugged. And I believe that, 450 years later, whatever it is, that we are now experiencing the legacy of that unplugging and the movement away from the heart and the feeling capacities into the head and into the mechanistic. And now we're paying for it. The planet is polluted. And many people, to come back to the raison d'etre of our conversation, are polluted by trauma and they don't quite know how to deal with it. So really, this body of work is opening up the possibility of how we can go deep into, well, what is it that is creating the restriction? What is it that's preventing the flow of abundance and joy and delight? What is creating the restriction? And you're pinpointing for us something that is held within the unconscious, that is beyond the light of consciousness and is sitting within the darkness of the shadow. And that I find particularly fascinating. So if we go back to the context that you've just given us of Castle Gate, Utah, then Scotland, and then the 1600s. How did that line of activity unweave itself? Or indeed, how did you weave it into the tapestry that you now have within the novel?
Oh, it's so complex. I went back and forth with it just because of the nature of the story itself, because I was seeing how it was playing out in current life. I don't want to tell too many, tales out of school to my family members, but I was noticing that it was affecting, we'll just say my mom. She's given me permission from the other side of the veil to tell some of her stories. She's the daughter of the people who went to Utah. And in her later years, she began behaving very badly, and And so we started looking at what was going on with her. And the more the dementia really riddled her thinking and her personality, she began to display aspects of herself that I had never seen before, but they really sort of fit with, hey, that fits in with this story. So I was able to see patterns in her that fit what happened with them. And then I would look into myself and say, wow, I have these similar patterns. So it's not a linear discovery. It's it bounces all over the place. Like for an example, I recently was diagnosed with COPD, which is bizarre. Why would I have, COPD? I'm not really a smoker. I'm not really. I never really noticed that I was having difficulty breathing until I started getting on these medication and realized, oh, that's what it feels like to take a deep breath. And so the more I thought about why would I have this, it occurred to me that after the mine explosion, the air in Castlegate was, the mine exploded and the town was filled with coal dust. A cloud of coal dust buried the town and nobody could breathe. The air was toxic. And my grandfather, who was 18 at the time, he wasn't in the mine because of layoffs. So he would have known his father was down there unable to breathe. So knowing his father couldn't breathe and himself being in town unable to take a deep breath, it occurs to me, well, maybe after this of days of not being able to breathe deeply, maybe he sort of got into this kinked up, I can't breathe deeply mode. And perhaps that's something that's been passed on to me. So the more that I'm learning to breathe deeply myself, the more I can feel his presence saying, yes, this is exactly what it is. And of course, there's no way to prove this, but the question is, does it help? Yes, it absolutely does. So it's this piecemeal. You put the pieces together, you follow the breadcrumbs along, and I've sort of lost track of the question. But
Well, we were talking about Castlegate, and then we
Mhm.
were in Scotland, and then we were in the 17th century, the early 17th century. And so I just wondered, because they were quite big leaps, I wondered how those leaps had organized themselves, so to speak, in your consciousness. And it's
Right.
obviously that, from what we're seeing, from what we're perceiving as you tell out your story, is that you were really in a free fall in consciousness, or a free flow of consciousness, where suddenly, because of your natural curiosity of spirit, that something would come up and it would be, whoa, what's this? And then that would lead to this and that would lead to this. As you were saying, it was like following the breadcrumbs.
Mhm. Yeah.
Why did they leave Scotland?
Okay, my understanding of it is that my great grandmother's brother was the superintendent of the mine over here. They were all coal miners back in Scotland. And William Littlejohn, her older brother, he was educated and he came to the States and he ended up being in charge of a mine in New Mexico first. And then he ended up in Utah and Castlegate and worked his way up to superintendent. And he had two of his brothers over here working with him. And in Scotland in 1921, actually the UK entirely, there was a national mining strike. This was after World War I ended and the subsidies for the mines was removed. So the government was no longer paying the miners' wages, and the owners of the mines cut their wages to pre-war levels. So I'm assuming, I don't know this for a fact, but it certainly makes sense that my great grandfather said, I'm not making any money here. Your brother is inviting us to go to the States. So that's my assumption, is that they got on a boat, they came over here, and were, starting a new life.
Yeah, fascinating. So it's interesting that they were obviously following the spirit lead through economic restraint. They were allowing themselves to enter into that wonderful sort of pioneering energy of what we know was still present during the latter part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, because we're talking about the 20s and the 30s, just prior to the Depression in the US and Prohibition. And and of course, the same thing was actually happening in the United Kingdom, Wales, and Scotland. There was a major economic slump after the First World War, which was immensely tragic and actually led to a general strike where all of the agencies, all of the facilitation processes in society, including the mining industry, because obviously at that time coal was still being used in terms of burning fires and producing heat and sustenance for cooking and so forth and so forth. This is no longer happening because of the extraordinary pollution that was created in the late 50s and 60s, which I can remember being born into. I can remember the great smog of 63, and it was just quite extraordinary. And it wasn't anything to do with a meteorological event. It was purely and simply to do with pollution as a result of the coal mining industry. However, so we have context for that particular aspect of the story. And then you leapt to the early 17th century. So how did that take place? To the origin of the curse?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Fire,
that was. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
fire.
Yes. Well, when I like I said, I already knew about the coal mine disaster, but I didn't pay much attention to it until I had this shamanic journey where this practitioner said, "You've got this curse," and I looked into it. So it was, again, the genealogy research that pulled me into the story. And again, this is very well documented, just like the Castle Gate story. So the more I looked into that, I ended up getting the court records. I when I went to Scotland, I went to the Mitchell Library in Glasgow and pulled up the actual. I had my hands on the documents, the confession documents. So I've really poured myself into learning as much as I can about that. And there's another sort of a side aspect here that I learned about. Not just me, I'm sure many people have this, but when I was growing up, I was raised Catholic, and I always had this sort of, I always questioned, this just doesn't make any sense. And so I sort of got away from Catholicism. And then when I started looking into my Scottish ancestry and discovered, well, these people were Presbyterian, they're Protestant. And there's this big holy war between Catholic and Protestant. In fact, the Civil War, which I didn't learn about growing up here in the States, we had our own Civil War, but the Civil War in the UK was about Catholicism versus Protestantism. And so I grew up with this holy war in my head. The questions that I was asking about Catholicism were the exact same objections that the Presbyterians had against it. And so this 1600s incident, this had a lot to do with the Scottish Covenanters, the Presbyterians. So by looking into that storyline as well, I was able to learn a lot about my spiritual beliefs and what's true for me and what's not, and the nature of God, etc. So this goes in so many different directions. It's so multidimensional. It's not just about fires and curses. It's also about my spirit self, my belief and connection with God.
Yeah, yeah. And that's lovely, because we'll come to this when we look at the breadth of this particular unique your story. So we still don't have full context for what took place in the witchcraft trials in Glasgow or the environs of, where the curse began. Who was cursing whom?
Okay. Well, the ancestor that we're talking about here, he was landed gentry. He was a sir. He was knighted, and he fell ill, mysteriously ill. Back then in those days, they didn't have modern medicine, and they didn't know what was wrong with him, and they couldn't
Do we
cure
have a
him.
name?
We do. His name was George Maxwell.
Sir George Maxwell.
Yes.
Good for
So
story. we can feel, suddenly there's a human being called Sir George.
Yes.
So he
I'm
became
sort of keeping
seriously.
it guarded because I'm writing the book and I want to sort of keep it close to the vest. But yes, it was Sir George Maxwell. So when he fell ill and they couldn't cure him, someone came forward and said, well, I know so and so has this. It was sort of a voodoo doll. It was a puppet, a wax doll with pins in it, and she led them to this family's house and walked into the house, reached behind the chimney, pulled out a doll with pins in it. Was it really there? Or did she have it with her? That's something that we will explore. But the fact of the matter is that through questioning and arrests, 5 people ended up being arrested, tried, convicted, and executed. And as they were being, they're being led to the gallows green, one of the women shouted out a curse. And that's when the curse took place. That she was, she's innocent. She's being murdered for something she didn't do. And she hollered out, I cursed your family to suffer as we suffer.
Mm.
And there you
And of
go.
course, putting it into the historic context,
Mhm.
this social convention of cursing was not uncommon. Today,
No.
it seems a slightly archaic form, which is associated with the arcane nature of witchcraft and wizardry and, spooky. It wasn't uncommon, that the nature of witchcraft and wizardry was very apparent, and there were trials all over the United Kingdom, which
Yes.
had just been created as a United Kingdom because of Elizabeth I's death in 1603, and of course dying without a male heir. James the second, James the Third of Scotland came down to become James the First, and that's when he was obviously a man who was into all sorts of libertine activities, which is interestingly being explored today through a series of very successful dramas on Netflix. However, he exposed a number of major witches that were around at that time, and that was when there was the great creation or the recreation of the witch finder general. So it was very, very, very common. But the point is that it had huge impact on Sir George Maxwell, and he passed. And then there is the belief, or there is the genealogical fact, that it was handed down to his son or his family in some way. Did he have offspring?
He had children. They did not have children. So he had 4, but none of them had children. So who's to say? Did the curse prevent them from having children? Who knows? We can only speculate. But the family, I curse your family. The family name, the Maxwell name, as far as I'm concerned, is what is now carrying this forward. And you were saying that cursing today it may not happen the same way, but all you really have to do is be very angry with somebody and say, I hope you die, or I hope you blah blah blah, whatever words you're hurling at somebody, if you mean it, you're cursing them.
So let's talk about the nature of this particular aspect of the frequency of the story and what ancestral healing really is all about. Because we're talking about emotional behaviors that impinge on the physiology of people's lives.
Mhm.
That's really what we're talking about. And if individuals are particularly awake to the substance of their emotional energies, for example, apropos what you've just shared with us of, I curse you, that is abhorrent to me in the level of consciousness arousal that I've really taken myself through over the years, of just simply responding to the extraordinary signs that the universe has provided me with, whether it be ill behavior or good behavior, the way that people interact with me. And being a public figure, I often I'm being told by psychics, clairvoyants, or seers that, by the way, you have negative energy around you because of the bombardment of projection. And particularly when I wrote the Diana book, I mean, the number of emails that I received from people saying, I'm going to kill you. And in fact, I had to get the police involved once at the very beginning of the process because a stalker discovered my home address and became very belligerent and difficult. So, emotional behaviors that were dysfunctional. And so, what are the techniques that we can use if we're experiencing this level of phenomenon or phenomena? What are the techniques that we can use within the emotional body that allows us to take full responsibility for what is taking place? Meaning that we're gradually beginning to fully understand that whatever we see before us is a mirror image of what's going on within our lives. So if we're actually experiencing some form of disharmony within our bodies or within our lives or within our personal relationships, or indeed extended relationships, that we need to take responsibility for the phenomenon and find ways of being able to heal, movement back to wholeness, or alchemicalize whatever those symptoms are, whatever the behaviors are, by rearranging our own process. So when you look into the story per se, and we're dealing with Castlegate explosion, the departure from Scotland, and then going back to Sir George Maxwell, what were the themes that create, that are the sort of description of what the curse elements are or were?
Um, my take on this, and there can be many others. As I said, this is multidimensional. My take on this was your family will suffer as we suffer. So it's not just that you are going to die in a fire or be affected by a fire. Your family will be torn apart. Because that's what happened with them. Their families were shredded. They were taken away from each other. And George Maxwell didn't have any grandchildren. His children didn't have family. So that's another aspect of it. Because if we look at the people who ended up in Castlegate, Bill Littlejohn, the superintendent of the mine, he didn't die in the fire, but he certainly watched as people were killed on his watch. His sister's husband was killed, and so it's not just that you will die in fire, you will suffer as we suffered. So that's those are the different ways that I'm looking at. And again, with the COPD, with the breathing, my mother had horrible claustrophobia, which, from being down in a darkened mine, I imagine that probably was, an epigenetic memory. There's so many facets to this that I think that people who are looking into their own family stories, they might not recognize, because it's not this dramatic mine explosion that I was lucky enough to, you can't miss this. I have a friend who, she couldn't wear turtleneck sweaters. She always felt like she was choking. And then when she looked into her family tree, she saw that one of them was hanged. So, these are the things, these energetic patterns that are being passed down. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Well, it opens up the avenue of inquiry that I was saying at the beginning of our conversation, that we can interrogate all these varying aspects, behaviors, as well as what actually took place in the situation. I mean, for example, the point that you've just made, where is the connection between what she was experiencing and the nature of the hanging? Because those two are disconnected, but they were made into a reality. So the point that I'm really driving us to is that we're beginning to understand the complexity of our human consciousness. And we're beginning to see that there are effectively three levels of conscious. There's the superconscious, the waking conscious, and the sleeping conscious, or the unconscious, or subconscious. And we're largely talking about that is being held within shadow, within the unconscious, that reappears as sociological, physiological, or emotional challenge. That's what we're really talking about. Now, we love stories, so we get really involved in the stories, and the stories go on and on and on and on. And if the stories go on and on and on and on, we generally speaking just keep reiterating, repeating the nature of the trauma. So it actually gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, which doesn't seem to me to be very intelligent. And so we're being led to this point of, well, it's interesting because when I look at the women in my family line, they all seem to have the same ailment. And it's to do, and I'm just creating a hypothesis, it's to do with the fact that they have difficulty breathing because three of them had asthma. One had some form of infantile pneumonia and found it very, very difficult to breathe. And the other had lung cancer. But actually, it's all to do with the fact that they have difficulty breathing. So, what sort of emotional behaviors do they display, for want of
Mhm.
a better word? And this investigation leads to the themes for why we share
Mhm.
on collective levels the woe of trauma.
Mhm.
Do you
Mhm.
see? And it
Yeah.
can be unconscious, but what we're really talking about, the only way that we can move forward and become the master mistresses of our own destiny is if we find ways of being able to really explore the darker aspect of our shadow and
Mhm.
recognize that our shadow, as Rumi would say, our wounds are where the greatest light is, so that we can transform or transmute the darkness into the light. And as a
Mhm.
result of that, we heal our personal karma, our ancestral karma, and the collective karma.
Mhm.
So that's what
Mhm.
I'm really talking about. What were the themes that emerged that are tangible emotional or social behaviors that can be utilized to heal, to expurgate, to atone, to extubate, to
Mhm.
release and burn the karmic ribbons? That's what I'm talking. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. In fact, if you don't mind, I'd like to bring it back to what you just said. You were talking about the women in your family who have
No, no, no,
difficulty
that was
breathing.
hypothetical. I was
Okay.
just creating a story. No, I was
Okay.
just creating a story.
Okay. Well, even so, it's interesting to me that your work is about breathing, and that's actually one of the things that triggered my uh, uh, wheels to start turning because I've heard you lead meditations and you say exhale, exhale, feel the need to breathe, and I'd never heard anyone put it that way before, and I was like, oh, and that's around the same time that I had this diagnosis, feel the need to breathe. I'd never bothered feeling the need to breathe. I just breathed or didn't breathe. So, but getting back to your question, what are the themes? How can I put this? Uh, I guess, how can I put this? One of the things that made this so difficult for me to have the breakthrough is, and I believe that this is part of the curse, is that don't look at it, don't look at it, don't look at it. You know, the horror of this story was so bad that we just can't even acknowledge it happened. We don't look at it. So by prying it open and realizing this really happened, these were real people. This wasn't some movie. This isn't some book I'm reading. These were real people and they were my family. And I mean, I remember my mom when I was growing up, you don't tell the family stories, you don't air your dirty laundry, you keep that stuff inside the family. So I think the theme for me, anyway, is exploration, forgiveness, understanding that these people were doing what everybody's always doing the best they can. Sometimes the best you can ends up hurting a lot of people. So I think for me, that was the biggest eye opener, literally eye opener. Look at it,
Hmm.
examine it, feel it, be it, become it, transmute it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it does in part. I feel you see that the theme that you're describing is the theme of fear.
Mhm.
And of course, fear, we know in this particular situation, emanated, as it were, in different ways for different individuals. But it particularly stopped people from expressing. So your mother had this idée fixe with don't tell anybody. So whatever's happening in the family, we don't talk about it. It has to be obscured. Now that's all well and good because it does seal the family with a boundary. So nobody understands really what's going on within the family. But the point is, within the family, you just don't talk about it. So there is deliberate obscurity. And where anything is pushed down or pushed in or contracted, it creates explosions. And we have Castle Gate mine explosion.
Yeah.
So in other words, the explosions take place, like inflammation within our bodies takes place, to explore how to bring the darkness into the light. So I'll give you a story that will explicate, that will explain, but it's an interesting story as well. What I was sharing last evening with my two psychic mystic friends when we were talking about cursing and how things gather within the ancestral line and how they can be healed. My mother had a cousin who was older than she, but was really like a sister. And they had great fun together. They were great friends. And this particular lady was called Lulu. Her real name was Violet, but her pet name was Lulu. And Lulu was quite an extraordinary human being. In the early part of the 20th century, she had been a companion to an immensely grand aristocratic lady within British society. And so she traveled the world with this particular lady. I mean, literally, she was a titled lady. She traveled the world and they were very close. So she was living the life of a substitute lady in many ways, looking after, as the companion, as almost the maid, looking after this particular lady. And a new chauffeur arrived because no longer was it necessary to have horses and carriages. So a new chauffeur arrived. And Lulu took one look at this young chauffeur and thought, you're rather nice. Well, to cut a long story short, they had an affair and she became pregnant, which of course was denounced during that particular period. We're talking about the 30s, just before the Second World War. However, they were honest about it. I mean, it was hugely revolutionary from a social point of view. They approached the said aristocrat, who was immensely understanding, and allowed them to get married so that the child could be legitimized and not bastardized. And so this young child came into creation. Now, these two people had a very loving marriage for, I think, maybe 50 or 60 years. And they were very much Darby and Joan. They were together the whole time. But I noticed as I grew and observed them that Arthur was always looking after the lady, always. I mean, he was really a slave to her. And they had this pact that they would die together because obviously the older they got, they were talking about their mortality. So they decided they'd have this pact. But actually, he fell down a flight of staircase and died before her. As soon as he died, she broke her hip. So she couldn't really look after herself. But after all, she had been looked after virtually all of her adult life. And so she decided through negotiations with the medics that she would go into a senior citizens' home. And when she was in this, I used to go and see her quite frequently. It was not in London, it was outside London. And she would always meet me at the door of the senior citizens' home, which was built on a lateral level, no stairs, for the obvious reason. And she would say, let's dance. And we would dance all the way down the corridor to her room, and then we would have tea. Well, to cut a long story short, because it could go on and on and on, the one particular period, she became so depressed that she decided she was going to leave and join Arthur. So she actually took an overdose. And she woke up in the middle of the night thinking, I'm in heaven. Wait a minute, this is all too familiar. and she realized that it hadn't worked. So she took more pills. But what she did was to take pills that were muscle relaxants. So she vomited, pulled the emergency cord, was taken into hospital, and her stomach was pumped out. This is an 88, 89-year-old woman. I think she may have been slightly older, actually. So I appear not to tick her off, but I appear to provide tender, loving care. And she's furious in the hospital bed because of what had taken place. And she's like, I want to die, I want to die. And I said, well, you're not going to leave until you've done what you came here to do. I don't know what you're talking about. So I introduced her to karma. This was not somebody who had an advanced religious or spiritual education. I introduced her to karma, and she listened, and she said, I wonder what my karmic theme is. And I said, what about selfishness? Because after all, you've been looked after by all of us all your life, and you're now being looked after by the people in the senior citizen home, and you're regarding them as your slaves, your love slaves. She actually said, they're my love slaves. So I said, I feel it's time for you to give back something from your heart. It has to be genuine. What can that be? Oh, I don't know. You're wise. What do you think? And I said, well, I've always noticed that you, whatever state you're in, you always have beautiful pedicure and manicure. What is it about feet? Oh, I love feet, she said. So I said, have you ever heard of a craft, a healing craft called reflexology? And she said, no, but she became immediately excited. So I introduced her to reflexology. She became a reflexologist, and she was doing the feet of all the oldies who were much younger, sometimes 30 years younger than she, in the senior citizen home, but they were they were ailing, they were not well. And as a result of this, she suddenly had this emission, this flow of love that she had always been receiving. And so she died 6 months later, a very, very happy lady in her sleep. That's what I'm talking about, you see, in terms of theme. That there are karmic themes that are embedded within us. I tell this story, and it's only a story. The point is what's actually going on within the literal substrata of what the story is all about. So, for example, it seems to me that your story is one of emotional obscurantism, of keeping emotionality obscure because of being frightened. And there's an element of betrayal somewhere there, because after all, Sir George Maxwell was engaged in a trial where he betrayed the common folk, and as a result, they were extinguished, they were killed, they were hung, drawn, and quartered, hanged, whatever. So that's really what I'm referring to. And I open this up as a possibility for people to really investigate in their own way. But it's very easy to do with surface, but we need to go deep into the very nature of the way that we're feeling, because feeling is the nature of the soul. Feeling is the language of the soul. So what am I really feeling? And we need to staunch the immediate reaction of, but I'm frightened, or that's scary, because that's another cap on our emotional bodies to keep the wounds in shadowlands. But if we can actually feel the stimuli, no matter how scary it is, detach, feel stillness through breath, and observe, then our soul leads us to the undercurrents that are deep within, that we can begin to really put our fingers on something highly genuine about the nature of what the story is really trying to reveal. And then we become much wiser. There is an ancient adage, belief, and maxim, particularly within the arcane, with that is hidden, that as soon as you discover the identity of something, you have power over it. And this, I won't tell you more stories, but this has really been explored by all the major spiritual teachers, all the major saints and prophets. I mean, Jesus, when he was asked by the people of Capernaum to do something about the madman that they were terrified of, just went up to him and said, "Who are you?" And the man said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." So in that moment, you see, we didn't just have the storyline, he's Legion, and there are different aspects. Obviously, he was multiple personality, and was very deranged by it. But automatically, the master, who'd been trained in wizardry, knew how to cast out the demons, the sub-personalities. And it says in the story that he cast them into a herd of swine, and the swine ran off the cliff edge, and the man was healed. So that's really what I'm talking about, the alchemy, the transformation of the negativity into the positivism. Yeah.
Okay.
Dear me, guess what? We've come to a close of our conversation, our deep dialogue. Could you perhaps give some information about the book before we leave?
Sure, absolutely. It's
I did.
here it is right here, Castle Gate. It's available
Hold it
wherever.
up again, my darling. Could you hold it up again? That was too fast. Can you hold it up again?
There
Yeah.
we go.
So they were wonderful cover, beautiful, beautiful.
Thank
And who is your publisher?
I published this myself, actually. I had a publisher lined up, but they weren't going to be able to get it done in time. I wanted it done in time for the 100-year anniversary, March 8th, 2024, because that's exactly 100 years. And so I was there in Castle Gate at the mine entrance at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. I laid some flowers there. I just sort of experienced the isness of the 100-year anniversary. And I know we're out of time, but I do want to respond to your saying, what was the resolution? I felt while I was there, we did there was a documentary, and we had a premiere and a panel afterwards. And it felt to me like visiting the cemetery, visiting the mine entrance, and speaking in front of a crowd of other people whose ancestors died there. It felt like we were releasing all of these men who had been killed in this horror, releasing them from this story that held them in hell. So that to me feels like that's what this is all about, is we've released these souls from where they were trapped, where they thought they were in hell.
Beautiful. Well done. Well done. So the point is that curses or spells can be dispelled.
Yes, yes,
And that's
absolutely.
transmutation. We just need to find out, well, what is the theme of the curse or the spell? Where is it rooted within the consciousness of the ancestral line, or within the individual, or within the geological space? And then we need to go in with our guardians, with our angels, with our spirit animals, with our totems. We need to go in possibly with help from people who know, go in and uproot it, and then we can heal. Gosh, I have so many stories. For example, of arriving with Roger Woolger, the great psychotherapist, who was a brilliant, brilliant man. We arrived at a conference in Thessalonica in Greece, and we went into this building where we were going to present the conference, which held 1,000 people. And as we walked in, we both realized that it was so contaminated that there was no way that we could allow anybody into the space. And we had something like 6 hours. So we sat in meditation. There were 3 of us. And we all in meditation were spoken to by guardians that showed us that the building sat on an ancient battle site. So what we were actually dealing with were all the unseen ones that were walking around without heads or limbs. So we were able to actually do an entire ritual. And as a result, they left, the audience came in, and we had the most amazing conference. Lisa, this has been extraordinary. Ryan, perhaps you can place Lisa's website on the screen for us. That's wonderful. And the book is available through Amazon.
Yep.
So there you are, ladies and gentlemen. You've got this extraordinary epic saga to take apart and apply to your own lives, hopefully. And please do send in questions if you need to. Send them to me, and then I can always send them on to Lisa if it's appropriate for you to receive them. Stuart@stuartpearce.com. And I look forward to seeing you next week, where we have the wonderful Lisa Barnett, who is the Akashic record teacher and one of the foremost within within that particular field of operation within mind, body, and spirit. She has the ability, she says, of being able to read the Akashic records. She has been on before, so it's going to be interesting to welcome her back. Lisa, thank you so much for being here, and please stay where you are. And to everybody, namaste, namaste, namaste. Thank you, Ryan.